Everything began after the fall of the Roman Empire. With its fall, the Roman Empire was divided into two political entities, one to govern the West and the other to govern the East. The eastern part became what most modern people now call the Byzantine Empire, while the western part of the empire became dysfunctional, as its sources of political power and economy were completely non-functional. With that development, the empire was incapable of raising armies from its own 30 million people, so it instead hired barbarians. These barbarians ended up taking over political power once they realized how rotten the internal organization really was. These internal organizations that govern the lives of the people only made their lives worse with all the corruption. So since the system was so broken, when the Western Empire fell, the health and quality of life for the average peasant in Western Europe actually improved, as the central government stopped working. From this political vacuum, two powers emerged: the German barbarians and the Catholic Church. The Germanic barbarians, in areas like England and along the Rhine, depopulated much of the native population and became the majority culture. However, in most of Western Europe, there weren't enough barbarians compared to the native population to have a huge effect on their demography. So, what happened in places like England and along the Rhine is that they became more Germanic, while places like France, Spain, and Italy mostly retained their Latin heritage. And since in the heart of the Roman Empire there hadn't been a major conflict that wasn't a civil war for over 400 years, the Roman elite were heavily pacified. Thus, the Germans took control as the warrior elite of society, becoming the nobility and kings, while the native elite often went into the church as priests. The church at this time was the sole functioning international literate organization in the West. It was also the only fully meritocratic organization, so the most talented people went into the church. This meant that money and talent flowed into the church, making it the most important cultural institution in Western Europe. Under these conditions, the West was born, marking the beginning of Western civilization under German, Latin, and Christian influence. These are the main philosophical and cultural influences on Western civilization: German, Latin, and Christianity. What happened after the fall of the Western Empire is many Germans established kingdoms that fought among themselves. From this conflict, the Frankish Empire rose victoriously. The Franks were so successful because they actively pursued a policy of working with the Catholic Church, which provided moral legitimacy. These Germans also introduced democracy to Europe through their noble obsession with legal rights. This German preoccupation with legal rights stemmed from their tribal war-band origins, which in the future would become the root of democratic ideas in Europe, which most people wrongly attribute to the ancient Greek tradition of republicanism. The Greeks and the Romans are generally credited with Western democracy, but this really wasn't the case. By the time the Roman Empire fell, it was an authoritarian theocratic mess with nothing that could be called democracy at all. Democracy in Athens had very little influence over the modern democratic tradition of the West, and was very different from the democratic tradition of the modern West. Equating the democracy of the modern West with the democracy of ancient Greece is very wrong. The origin of Greek democracy stemmed from the political organization of the city-state. City-states developed as oversized villages that never formed into centralized states. This city-state organization led to something akin to democracy. The major transition that allowed democracy to emerge in the classical world was the phalanx, a block of spearmen. Until around 600 BC, in both Italy and Greece, the main form of warfare was aristocratic horsemen who lorded over largely unarmed peasantry, resulting in deeply unequal kingdoms. This is since political power and inequality is heavily influenced by the methods of warfare that they are predictive. This is also the case in Greece, where when the main form of warfare shifted from small aristocratic groups of horsemen to large blocks of spearmen, so does society will democratized on both political and economic levels. This development meant that traditional monarchies did not survive in Greece and Rome. The continuing thread between Athens, Sparta, and Rome was that those men who could afford armor to fight, typically a little over 10% of the population, were given the vote, while the lower classes often had nearly worthless votes. But this was still revolutionary for their era. Before the classical era, the world was divided between god-kings and barbarian tribes. But everything changed when this new organization was adopted. This new organization meant that classical society was built around cooperation and control over men. Since systems like the phalanx emphasized collective cooperation, it meant control among men is normalized to maintain the shield wall. This meant these societies controlled the lives of every individual in that society in every possible way to maintain social order. This was because the usual methods of warfare bled into societal governance. Just as the army controlled individuals to maintain the shield wall, society also created systems that were heavily centralized. Democracy in the classical world was not freedom, and in truth, these were remarkably unfree societies. The individual was freer in despotic Persia than in Athens or Sparta. In most ancient Greek city-states, it was illegal to be a bachelor. There were state-mandated political events and religious ceremonies to keep track of, which added up to a significant amount of time. In addition, there were laws regulating how to eat and address people. In ancient Athens, the amount of time the average citizen would spend in political meetings equaled a full-time job, which was allowable because slaves did most of the work. These were societies with no sense of property or individual rights. The city could take their property since it belonged to the city. If people didn't conform, they could be ostracized and forever banished from the city just for that reason. The individual was not viewed as an atom, but as belonging to the state, with no outside identity. In Sparta, this was taken to extremes, with the state taking boys at the age of 7 and raising them in military camps. They lived for the rest of their lives in the military, only being able to see their wives rarely until the age of 40. If a Spartan woman wanted to breed with what the state saw as a strong young male, the husband was legally not allowed to refuse, since the healthiest were expected to breed the most, as a form of eugenics. The child was treated as the property of the state. Spartans would say they were the freest people in the world, to which the reply was that they had enslaved themselves. Even so, the sense of brotherhood among the phalanx and democracy allowed a large degree of cultural unity, which enabled heroic actions like fighting off the Persians, the famous stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, and allowed the Greeks to undertake absolutely incredible actions like Xenophon's march of the 10,000 and controlling Mediterranean trade. All this cold happened because the Greek had such a remarkable degree of cultural unity that came from the city-state organization. But as the phalanx became less and less effective due to the implementation of horsemen and archers, so did Greek democracy vanish. Even so, this type of democracy is very different from Western democracy, which holds that every individual is entitled to participate in the state. The origin of Western democratic traditions lies in the Germanic tribesmen, who believed that every member of the war band had freedoms conferred upon him as a man. These included legal freedoms and the right to elect the next king and leader of the war band. These rights were retained by the nobility, who jealously guarded them throughout the Middle Ages. This meant that the authority of the king was not as absolute as in Asiatic monarchies like China and Persia. Democracy in the West doesn't stem from peasant equality, but from elitist aristocracy. The West just kept on including more and more people in the group of the elite, or it can be read as more people becoming included in the category of the elite. This can be seen in the development of democracy in the Western world. First, the rich were given the vote, then people with income, then all men, and then women. The development of democracy in the West stemmed not from an imagined equality, but from a feeling of entitlement as a part of a war band, which privileged them to be given legal freedoms, just like the ancient Germans. This right was further strengthened by the nobles, who established strong parliaments to guard their rights. The idea that Western democracy comes from the Greeks and Romans is a post hoc notion, as Enlightenment philosophers were trying to justify their democracies with their admiration for the Greeks and Romans, and thus drew a connection that wasn't there. This emphasis on legal rights also reinforced personal and property rights, something very special for the Western world. However, the Frankish Empire had no bureaucratic structure, and so once it stopped having good leaders, it collapsed. This opened up the West to attacks from all sides, from the Hungarians, the Vikings, the Muslims, and the Slavs, which meant the West faced several centuries of deprivations. To start with, the Muslims took control of the Mediterranean from around 700 to 1000. This is important because it split the Mediterranean into three: the West, the Muslim, and the Orthodox. If the Muslim conquest had never happened, the center of the West might have remained around Italy and the Mediterranean, as North Africa and Italy were very rich, meaning that it could have become a powerful center of Western society. Instead, what happened is the Muslim pirates forced the center of Western civilization to move to the area around France and southern England. It also cut the West off from the Eastern Roman Empire, thus accentuating the difference between Orthodox and Western civilization. The nations of the modern West formed to fight off these outside invaders. Spain and Portugal were frontier nations against the Muslims. France, England, and Scotland all formed on the frontier to fight against the pagan Vikings. Germany and Austria formed to fight off the Hungarian and Slavic hordes. The West spent centuries being sacked and raided by Muslim invaders from the south, Hungarian war bands from the east, and Viking plunderers from the north. It was in this climate of quite literal physical insecurity that feudalism was born. The pressure from all the invaders resulted in the West forming feudalism and knights. Since the central authority was so weak and the raiders were normally so fast, people turned to local leadership. These knights confined the peasantry and turned them into serfs. Under most circumstances, each knight would build his own castle, which further accentuated the weakening of the central power system and strengthened the aristocracy. Contrary to what most people think, feudalism was extremely effective. It protected the peasants and allowed economic and population growth. The knights were the most effective warriors in the world, barring nomadic tribes like the Mongols. This allowed Western civilization to expand to a massive degree. In the years between 300–1300 AD, Western feudalism with the knights reconquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, southern Italy, the Balkans, the Levantine coast, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. As the climate started to stabilize, the Viking pirates in the north transitioned into merchants of Western society as they shifted to peaceful trading. This created a culture of merchants who were well armed and hard to regulate without facing backlash. Trading in open ocean also meant that the governments were unable to regulate trade as strictly as if they traded in rivers or on land, since the sea is so vast and hard to administer. This combination meant that the government lacked the ability to effectively regulate trade. This created a strong autonomous merchant class with a heritage from the well-armed Vikings and a large amount of autonomy, a phenomenon that couldn't occur in any other part of the world. Western merchants are more autonomous than Eastern merchants, who are heavily regulated. Unlike Western merchants, Eastern merchants mostly trade over land and rivers, which means those societies have weak merchant classes, stifling prosperity for the whole society. This culture of well-armed merchants and the German private property created the climate needed for ideas like capitalism to be exercised, and as technology advanced, areas in northern Europe that were previously unfarmable due to the cold now became arable. A heavier plough was developed that could turn northern Europe into the most productive farmland in the western parts of Eurasia. This, combined with a warmer climate and technological spread from the Middle East and Byzantium, allowed for massive population growth in the West. By 1250, Western civilization was practically equal to any of the other Eurasian civilizations. Under all of this development, the glue that held society together was Christianity. Christianity's domination began with Emperor Constantine, who exempted the Christian Church of the Roman Empire from taxation, justified by the assumption that the Church would relieve the state of some of its functions. With this, The higher officers of the clergy became able to exercise authority over economically active territories, creating an organization that spread throughout Europe, which was influential and partially in charge of some functions of government. The Church was not a clan or a state, but an association bound by a code and a creed. With overall short life expectancies and the inability of landlords to pass on land to bloodlines as inheritance, the Latin Church grew in power as land without heirs often became its property. Latin Christianity, as opposed to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, became an increasingly independent, self-sustained entity with moral authority over the states. This development is very different from the Orthodox civilization, where the Church served the monarch, and a delicate structure was created to enhance the power of the monarch. This is a very different development from the West, where the Church competed with many other estates and the Crown for influence over society, functioning as an independent, self-sustained entity. This meant that in Western civilization, the warlords would bicker and fight each other over land, resources, and influence just like in any other part of the world. But for over 1,000 years, the warrior chiefs and later kings of Europe would legitimize themselves by subordinating themselves to the guard of their peasants, making the Church a very powerful institution in this society. The papacy started to preside and wag its finger over kings, as the legitimacy of the king was based on the approval of the Pope. Therefore, it was important for kings to capitalize on being in good standing with the institution of Christianity embodied in the Catholic Church. This structure did not mean the Church had full control, as it still needed to compete with local rulers and other estates, creating a balance of power. This structure was significant as it limited Western civilization from dogmatic theocracy like in India and the absolute tyranny of the crown like in China. However, as the Pope became more powerful, they created the Papal States, turning the Catholic priesthood from its seat in Rome into an even more empowered entity. They became a landowning institution without dynastic heredity of their power, almost aristocrats without an actual aristocracy, but rather managed within a hierarchy of piety. The growing power of the Church drove what amounted to massive social engineering throughout society in an effort to strengthen Christianity. One of the first social engineering efforts was the destruction of the family. Before this, Roman society was, in many ways, built around the extensive lineages of the aristocratic families that governed Rome. This system involved large families where the son, parents, and grandparents lived together to empower the whole family. This structure was very good for stability, but also had negative effects on society. The benefit of this structure was its stability. Everything was very structured, and everybody took care of everybody for the benefit of the collective. This meant a stable family, as there were many people who supported the structure. One gone doesn't mean the whole system crumbles, which promoted order and stability. A stable family meant a stable society. As society is made up of families, so a stable family meant a stable society. This was true for many societies that adopted this model as they are stable. This structure also promoted hierarchy, as hierarchy was already normalized in the family, making people more accepting of hierarchy. Since many family structures dictate what is normal for somebody, if they are already socialized to accept hierarchy and not question authority and elders, they will grow up to do the same with the state. Psychologically, the state is a sort of representation of the family. This normalization created a more stable monarchic society. However, despite its benefits, this type of family structure also had its downsides. Under this structure, women were treated worse, as their individuality was not considered, only what they could contribute to the whole clan. The husband became the slave of the father, and the wife became the slave of the husband. This was the social contract designed to motivate the husband in this social structure. They were promised relief from giving their all for the clan and an opportunity in the future to have their own house, with their son becoming their slave, just as they were currently. This is not a literal slave, but an expectation of the family, as the husband answers to the father like a slave answers to his master. This was a very bad structure for women in that society, as they were the ones with a master without a slave. In this society, Many practices that modern people view as barbaric, such as widow burning and foot binding, were common due to the high expectations placed on women. This hierarchical order can be seen even in their language. In many languages with this structure, distinctions between uncle and aunt are based on their position relative to the father. Cousins also have specific words for the older brother of the father, whereas many languages only use uncle for the father's brother and older brother. But in this structure, there is a clear separation, which shows how much emphasis is placed on the order and hierarchy of each family member. Living under the same roof with many other women, such as their mother-in-law and sister-in-law, meant the household was also more tense, creating resentment within the household. This is something very common in many large families in Asia, where many family members bicker about contributions, from jobs to domestic work. This family structure also promoted clientelism and nepotism, as supporting someone sometimes meant supporting them in gaining office and other corrupt practices that harmed society overall. This is very common, as there is an expectation of helping family members, and it becomes the job of the grandfather to secure jobs and positions for his son and grandson. This clan-based family structure can still be seen in many parts of the world today, from the herder families of Arabia to the Confucian families of East Asia. But this structure of family is nowhere to be found in Europe. This is because the Catholic Church accomplished one of the biggest social transformations of this era, the destruction of the family. For most of history, people lived within clans, leading to marriages between certain degrees of cousins to keep wealth and influence within the clan. That is what the clan family structure is. However, as the Church took a strong stance against cousin marriages, as well as practices like widow marriage, adoption, and divorce, practices essential to tribal family structures, these tribal kinship structures became undermined and eventually disbanded after Christianity became the state religion. Long family lineages that were important throughout previous centuries of Roman rule became increasingly irrelevant, with many of these changes reinforced by the emerging Catholic Church. With the clan system fading, the nuclear family became the center of life, and the individual became the most important component of society. With this shift, many marriages in the West now consider compatibility more important than gaining influence for the family. This meant many marriages happen because of love in Europe rather than influence, at least more so than in many other societies. This culture of marrying for oneself in many Asian countries is considered selfish and represents a very different perspective from the Western view. The type of marriage that Western society popularized created a new type of family organization, the atomic family. This family unit separates society into individuals, but even if they are separate, they work independently to build up society. This is a very different structure from most of the world, where the family is a web that holds society together. This atomic culture created a sense of individualism, leading to the West adopting a different moral framework from the rest of the world, becoming a guilt-based culture where one's sense of morality was driven by a personal relationship with God or one's personal sense of morality. This cannot be solely attributed to the change in family structure from Christianity, but also to the Western concept of God as an ever-watchful entity, which led to a belief that one was morally deficient for not living up to personal moral standards. This individualism contributed to the West abolishing slavery relatively early within Europe, with the Catholic Church playing a significant role in its abolition in the 11th century. Western Christianity, despite its own history of slavery, has always been uncomfortable with the institution, contrasting with Islamic civilization, which engaged in the largest slave trade until the West pressured its abolition in the early 20th century. This guilt-based morality is very rare in history, as for most of the world, might makes right. However, Western civilization is the first to largely reflect on the cycle of oppression that it perpetuates. This inward reflection is quite particular in history. The West is the biggest critic of its own actions and has led to many positive changes, something that many other civilizations may not do and have proven slow to learn from over many centuries. Additionally, another massive social engineering effort by the Church was the institution of laws dictating that property could only be passed down to direct heirs. This resulted in widows owning property and the creation of a legal framework for women to own property, thereby strengthening women's legal rights. With this law, the tribal European family, with its kinship-based large families, largely disappeared by the year 1000. The tribal structures of Germanic, Nordic, Hungarian, and Slavic peoples fell within generations of their conversion to Christianity. The Church also banned polygamy and divorce, raising the value of upper-class women who held a monopoly on the family's reproductive success, thereby enhancing the status of women in the West compared to other regions. This is the basis of women's rights in Europe, which would later expand with many other philosophical thoughts, and then spread to the rest of the world. The dominance of the Church over law also meant a separation between secular law and religious law. Under secular law, people were treated differently based on their social standing. A king and a peasant received different punishments for the same crime. However, under church law, both king and peasant were treated as equals under God. This principle bled into secular law, creating equality under the law. In other words, the Church created the framework for legal equality under the law, something that was very revolutionary for human society, which would become the basis for equality under the law in the modern world. From a low and downright barbaric position, Western civilization managed to secure its position. However, Europe was divided into many kingdoms, each with its own internal interests. The state entity in Europe was extremely divided and autonomous, with every part of society being strong. A strong church due to the influence of the Catholic Church, a strong nobility guarding their rights from their Germanic past, and a strong merchant class armed and autonomous, and with a weak central government. This division meant that Europe was split into many kingdoms and interest groups, with no single empire able to dominate Europe. As it was challenging to manage such a divided region, there was no singular empire that could reunite the West like the Roman Empire did. But this seemingly weak position is what made the West so powerful. This social and political structure allowed Western civilization to be competitive continually, forcing Western society to compete politically. Europe never united into big empires like the Ming, Ottomans, or Mughals, but instead had warring states like France, Austria, Spain, and others who continually fight each other. This endless military competition forced an arms race that resulted in mass technological and social progress. Military competition resulted in technological progress, and this military progress got adopted into civilian life as states modernized to avoid being annexed by their neighbors, leading to the creation of a somewhat modern meritocratic state. The West, with kings and its divided subjects and social structure, also had an advantage over other Eurasian civilizations. Usually, a single social class controlled the whole society. Bureaucrats in China, priests in India, and an alliance of priests and warriors in Islamic civilization. This meant that the main flaws of that social group were able to manifest broadly across society. The Indian priests and Chinese bureaucrats disbanded the military, so they were continually crushed by nomadic tribes, while the Islamic warriors and priests essentially made a deal to suppress merchants, which stifled wealth and innovation. But in medieval Europe, the power structure was heavily divided, with the church, towns, and nobility vying for power against each other. This meant that the king had very limited control, leading to a strong balance of power that kept all of these groups in check. But the big development in Western society was the combination of the German tradition of legal rights and the strong merchant class. This combination meant that society had a strong tradition of property rights, which was critical for industrialization since people needed large investments to build something like a factory. These two factors provided the groundwork for capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, which first began in the Netherlands to fund colonial ventures. This meant that for most of Western history, the market was more powerful than the state. This can be seen when Spain tried to override the market with state power. It only led to the collapse of their currency and trade against international gold. The states that succeeded in the West were those that worked with the market rather than against it. This shift meant that society became less structured around authority and class and more around ability and money. Another significant development for Western civilization is that the Church concluded that in order to find God, one should study the outside world, as God made the world, and by observing it, one could understand God. This perspective easily led to the development of modern science. In contrast, Islamic civilization, after its golden age, deemed empirical study of the outside world irrelevant because they believed that God could change the world in an instant. Meanwhile, in China and India, Confucian scholars and Indian priests focused on debating the spiritual world, resulting in logical rabbit holes without practical application. This meant Western civilization became the best place for creative, independent thinkers, not because of the absence of the Church, but because the Church, as the most powerful cultural institution, supported this development, unlike in many societies where the elite heavily suppress free thinkers to avoid upsetting their power and legitimacy. The strong role of the Church in Western civilization's scientific revolution cannot be undermined. The modern world often discredits their contribution, but in reality, the Church laid the groundwork for scientific inquiry. Many people recount the story of Galileo to illustrate the Church's backward views, but cases like Galileo mostly happened because those individuals fell victim to church politics, not because of an imagined inherent hatred from the Church. This conflict over church politics resulted in some persecution, which created many people who were angry with the Church, one of whom was Martin Luther, who nailed 95 complaints about the Church and how it had been corrupted by the material world. This led to the Reformation, which broke to create Protestantism and many of its sects. Protestantism further entrenched the cultural assumptions of the Western world about a personal God, which strengthened their guild-based culture, a strong sense of personal responsibility, and an emphasis on work, all of which reinforced the legitimacy of capitalistic ideas. Protestantism also fostered a reading and writing renaissance, as normal peasants were now expected and encouraged to learn about God, bolstering literacy in the Western world, just as in the Islamic world, which also encouraged reading. This Protestant emphasis on education influenced the Scandinavian model of education, which sees education as being for the collective good of society, aiming to create a more educated society, which eventually led to the creation of public education, starting as religious schools. This is true for most of European development. Many institutions stem from Protestant idealism, which the German bureaucracy used to create strong social institutions, with public schools being one of them. The Protestant idealism to educate their citizens was used by the state to create a strong and educated citizenry to strengthen the nation's military force. One might argue that the desire to create a militarized society is the real reason, but it must be remembered that the philosophical foundation of this thought is rooted in Protestant idealism, aiming to educate all citizens to create a better society. Under this climate of conflict between Catholic and Protestant factions, they concluded that humans cannot be forced to believe in God, as a true believer is someone who genuinely believes in God in their heart. This conclusion made the West a more tolerant society for those who questioned God and laid the foundation for secularism and a secular state. This development challenged the Muslim monopoly on tolerance, as the West fostered a culture of greater tolerance and respect than the Muslim world. In the past, many intellectuals, especially Jews, were persecuted and moved to the Muslim world, which, even with its discriminatory laws, was still more tolerant than the Christian world. However, with this new acceptance, Western society became more tolerant of independent thinkers and other believers. The tolerance of the West is also very different from the tolerance of the Islamic world, which exemplified by the Ottoman Empire. Tolerance in Islam is often a tolerance of exclusion. One is treated as a second-class citizen. Jews in the Ottoman Empire were still not allowed to construct new places of worship, were not permitted to practice their religion in public, and their testimony in court was only worth half that of a Muslim. This is not tolerance of acceptance, but a tolerance of exclusion. While this was much more open than medieval Christendom, which burned people at the stake for professing heresy, it was still a discriminatory system. This is very different from the philosophical concept of tolerance in the West, which views God as a personal matter that society cannot force upon individuals, and thus it is not the state's business to intervene. Society is also expected to be tolerant of others with different interpretations or beliefs to maintain social order. This expectation arose because of the many religious conflicts that Protestants and Catholics have bitterly fought over, which led to the desire to avoid repeating past wars that drained both sides. In the past, many people died in religious conflicts trying to cleanse their lands of heresy and heathens. However, this change created a shift in culture, leading many states to invite intellectuals, even those who went against orthodox beliefs. This led the West to develop more scientific breakthroughs since there was a new acceptance of novel ideas that went against orthodox beliefs, which meant people could think without the fear of being burned if they stated something that might challenge the Church's power. So, while the West engaged in studying the real world and became a tolerant place, leveraging their technological advantage, the rest of the world stagnated. This allowed the West to expand throughout the world. The technological and societal developments, coupled with a warlike spirit, meant that Europe sought to expand, trade, and prosper. However, the Ottoman Empire blocked them from trading with China, forcing European nations to find alternative routes. Spanish exploration led to the discovery of the Americas. The effects of colonialism were significant and complex worldwide. From the West's perspective, the major conquests in areas like Asia and Africa had minimal direct effects. Instead, the significant impacts of colonialism on the West were primarily in the New World. The introduction of New World crops, such as potatoes from the Peruvian Andes, played a crucial role in industrialization. The expansion of Western civilization into temperate North America allowed for a doubling of land size and a population increase of over 50%. The European settlement of North America was remarkable, with 90% of the native population dying due to disease and Western atrocities. This was followed by a replacement with a different population that rapidly spread across the continent without significantly altering its original social structure. It cannot be denied that Western civilization has done many terrible things to the Native Americans. The only chain that held them back was Christianity. Many might think Christianity exacerbated these atrocities, but in reality, the Church opposed the cruelty inflicted on the native population. While colonizers aimed to maximize exploitation, the Church sought to convert the natives to their God. Although this was still cruel, compared to other societies and civilizations, the West could have done worse. Western civilization is unique in that it largely reflects on its actions and allows for reforms that stop the cycle of repression. Someone who is not biased and truly looks at the world will see that other peoples might have done the same, and what makes the West different is its reflection on its actions, a practice many other societies do not undertake. This reflection is partly due to the moral framework from their Abrahamic beliefs. The biggest critics of the West are often the West itself, without realizing that many would have done worse. This populating of America also shifted the internal balance of Western civilization away from the continent to the island. Previously, Britain was developed but relatively small, while now English speakers comprise the largest Western group with a population exceeding 400 million. Typically, civilizations unify under a continental, highly militaristic bureaucratic state. However, America, with its British values of democracy, liberalism, and capitalism suited for a small mercantile island nation, emerged as a dominant power despite its continental size. This is because America faced minimal military competition from Native Americans, allowing it to expand while maintaining a British social structure. Consequently, America acquired the benefits of a wealthy island nation on a continental scale, becoming the dominant power within the West. Meanwhile, the Portuguese set sail eastward and discovered a new route to India and China. The competitiveness of Europe became evident in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese were the first to arrive, but were notoriously corrupt, with the viceroy often living lavishly while sailors suffered on the boats. Subsequently, the Dutch replaced them, despite their poor treatment of the native population and widespread hatred. Eventually, the British took over and proved to be the most effective empire of the three. This shows how ongoing competition allowed the West to maintain dynamism and dominance over their colonies. This culminated in the establishment of the British-American world order. The British-American world order is distinguished by a concern for morality. Unlike empires such as the Assyrians, Hun, or Mughals, who were indifferent to practices like slavery and the killing of their subjects, the Americans and British actively campaigned against such injustices. The American Civil War, which cost 500,000 lives, was fought to end slavery, while the British spearheaded efforts to abolish slavery worldwide after ending it within their own territories. The West has committed many horrible acts. What makes it exceptional is its society's desire to address and rectify their injustices. The West has consistently worked to expand personal freedoms among the subjects of their empires and uphold the laws of war, refraining from targeting civilians, an ethos upheld primarily by the Anglo-American order and neighboring countries. The implementation may not have been perfect, and many atrocities are still committed, but at least they try, something that only a few empires, such as their Abrahamic counterpart, Islamic civilizations, do, and very rarely practiced on a large scale by any other civilization. The West has experienced 1,000 years of continuous growth. However, it all ended with the World Wars, which saw its weaknesses begin to emerge, echoing Aristotle's notion that one's greatest strength, taken to the extreme, becomes their greatest weakness. Before the World Wars, the West embraced beliefs in its racial, moral, religious, and civilizational superiority, which justified its vast wealth and power. However, events like the Holocaust, trench warfare, the discoveries of Charles Darwin, and the defeat of Western powers by non-Western forces shattered this belief in Western exceptionalism. Without a divine entity to absolve them, the overwhelming guilt became intolerable. The West's guilt-based individualist system, which had propelled it forward, now became a liability. Central to this issue is the absence of the Christian bedrock that had underpinned Western morality throughout history. Without it, there is no moral structure to justify actions, leading to the hatred of any endeavor as envious eyes scrutinize. In the absence of a belief in the afterlife, communism arises as a means to rectify real-world inequalities. Romanticism serves as a coping mechanism for the lack of existential meaning, but easily collapses into emotional turmoil when confronted with life's mundane realities. Similarly, modern neoliberalism prioritizes rapid wealth accumulation without considering broader societal impacts, leading to societal disruption. The West has become a materialistic, hedonistic, and godless society. The West is haunted by its history, with its own citizens often being its fiercest critics. Institutional self-flagellation is prevalent, with Western governments funding artists and movements that seek to dismantle them. Universities instill a sense of disloyalty to Western societies, further eroding shared values derived from Christianity. For the past few decades, the West's wealth, built from its past innovations, has allowed it to defer these existential questions. However, these issues are becoming increasingly urgent. Nietzsche said that one can judge a man by how much truth he can handle. This resonates deeply in the context of the West's pursuit of truth. Perhaps the West saw more than was healthy for society, a world without clear evidence of God, where barbarity persists despite centuries of progress, and where the only law seems to be cruel Darwinism. Western man, once believing he was guided by God toward greater glory, now finds himself struggling with disillusionment and depression. He may even harbor resentment toward those who still possess the courage to strive forward. The question remains, will the West rise again?